What's email? What does it mean?
Communication is the imparting or exchanging of information or news.
The single biggest problem in communication is the illusion that it has taken place.
Conversation is the oral exchange of sentiments, observations, opinions, or ideas.
Forbes Books Radio presents The Conversation with Clinton M. Padgett.
Today I'm having a conversation with Jenny Blake. The word pivot has been used a lot over the last several months, but today I'm joined by the person who literally wrote the book on pivoting. Jenny is the founder and CEO of the Pivot Method, a change strategy company that helps growth-oriented individuals and forward-thinking organizations map what's next. She's also the author of Pivot, The Only Move That Matters Is Your Next One. Jenny, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me, Clint. I'm honored to be here.
I'm happy to have you on the show. So the title of your second book is Pivot, obviously a very popular word these days. Small businesses are pivoting to try and stay afloat, and there are other pivots that are happening right now with people working from home, supporting their customers in different ways, whether you have a restaurant that's had to go to delivery only, selling products from an appropriate social distance. It looks like now is a good time to be an expert at pivoting, so you must be really excited.
It really is the year of the pivot. Just like you, I keep hearing it every single day in every different context, and we all got pivoted when this pandemic hit. I know we're both based in the States, so that was about mid-March, and there's not a single person in the country, let alone the planet, that has not been impacted by this in some way. So as the world hit pause, we've all been asked to pivot and figure out how are we going to do things differently moving forward, everything from our health to working from home to shifting the nature of our work, and for so many people, figuring out what they're going to even do for work.
Yeah, when I was right before the lockdown kind of happened, I was in India in 3 different cities in 2 weeks. And obviously it's a huge country with lots and lots of people. And my colleague I was talking to when I got back to the States and we went into lockdown, he told me they went into lockdown and people actually followed the rules. And he said it was kind of eerie to see these massive cities with hundreds of thousands and millions of people that suddenly are ghost towns. So it's interesting time for sure.
I can imagine. That's how it's been. I live in New York City, a crowded city, crowded neighborhood, and it's been shocking to see no cars out. The people that are out have masks on. And I mean, now that's everybody's day-to-day experience, but it's very wild to see New York City in that context. It's truly like living in a movie.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I've been to New York maybe a dozen times, and it's always been one of the crowdedest places I've ever been to. Tokyo comes to mind, but New York City's crowded. So to see it like I did on the news with all of the empty streets was just crazy. I never would have thought I would see that. So, okay, for someone that isn't familiar with your book, kind of what is the pivot method? And by the way, I loved your basketball analogy, the way you use it to describe it in the book.
Thank you so much. Yeah, the basketball metaphor is, for starters, I adopted the mantra, if change is the only constant, let's get better at it. I never felt very resilient to change. I felt that I kept hitting these pivot points or plateaus that I call them now. They always felt like crises at the time, every couple years. And I couldn't understand this sense of restlessness that I was experiencing, or why I could be working at a startup and get bored, working at Google, my dream job, and get bored, leaving Google, starting my own business and almost hitting bottom financially and having to shut the business down and go find another job. So every time one of these moments happened, I felt completely upside down and confused. I felt like it was my fault, like there was something wrong with me, I'm delusional, or I'm just never going to be happy. So part of what motivated Pivot and the metaphor of the basketball player was this aha moment where I realized that every time I was trying to change, I was so focused on what wasn't working, what I didn't want, what I didn't know, what I didn't have, that none of that moved me forward. And when you think of a basketball player, when they stop dribbling, one foot stays planted. That's their strength, their stability, their foundation. And then they can look for passing options with the other foot. So for me, this was 2 years after leaving Google, 2 years into running my own business. I needed to go back and say, what is working? What can I double down on? What's my strengths? What's my vision? How do I create that really stable plant foot so that I can pivot in a new related direction? Because a pivot is not a 180. And we're seeing that even now during this pandemic, the restaurants that have stayed operational have shifted. They didn't become a remote dog grooming service. They're still a restaurant. They still revolve around food and serving people during this time, but they might have pivoted to delivery or pickup service or simplifying their menu, changing their pricing, doing all these experiments based on what is working. And that's what this time is asking all of us to do, is look at what's working, even if it's just 10% of what you were doing before, and then how do we adapt in a related way based on our strengths to what the world needs now. which is very different than when we started 2020.
So with the pivot method, and you talked about plant, and there's like 4 steps, and I think leadership maybe is the 5th one. So kind of from a very high level, what are the 4 stages?
Plant, scan, pilot, launch. And you said it, you got the bonus stage, if you will. To switch metaphors for a moment, think of Google Maps. So the plant stage is you are here. And it's also helpful when you're going to map somewhere to say, where do you generally want to end up? Part of the reason I wrote Pivot is that I thought this, where do you see yourself in 5 years, is completely out of date. Now we don't even know 3 months from now what our lives are going to look like. So the plant stage is about saying what is working, what does energize you, what are your strengths, skills, and experiences, and what does success look like? So during the pandemic, maybe it's just what does success look like 3 months from now or 1 month from now, while still holding a higher vision for, let's say, 1 year from now. I've heard a lot of people ask the question, what would you be proud to look back on your life, how you handled this time? What would make you feel proud? So that's the plant stage. And then the scan is looking for people, skills, and projects that relate to your strengths or to your vision. Pilot is where we start passing the basketball around the court. Pilot is to say, none of us know the answers. None of us, especially now, can predict the future. Not even the pundits, not the experts, not the politicians. So how do we run small experiments that are safe enough to try, that allow us to test what it might look like to double down on those strengths or to work toward our vision? And so pilot is one of my favorite stages of the pivot method, is just that sense of open exploration and not having to have the answers up front, but rather running these small experiments and letting the pilots inform us about which ones take on momentum. And you can work through plant, scan, pilot over and over, but eventually launch is where you go all in on a new direction. I like to think of launch, there's the big L launch. Maybe some of you listening have been fired or furloughed, or you're a CEO and you've had to make some cuts in your team. Launch is kind of indicating that new direction. Airbnb launched a virtual experiences offering during this time. So we know they've been hit very hard, but why not have guests in Spain and Italy teach dance classes, cooking classes, not guests, the hosts? That's a very interesting pilot and launching this new stream of activities that fit the moment. That's the 4 stages. Another way to think of launch is just little L launch. What are 1 or 2 resonant next steps? Like even after listening to this conversation, what is just 1 small next step you can take, and what 1 next step would make the biggest impact?
Interesting. Now you chose to leave Google and try something different. Is the process really any different for those that are kind of being forced to pivot today?
Getting pivoted, not by choice, but by circumstance, sometimes that can be quite shocking in the moment. So for those who are choosing to pivot and have already chosen to make a certain type of change, they've just had a little more time for processing. A lot of pivots involve saying no to something good that there's a lot of confusion around. Well, should I leave? Should I stay or should I go? The difference for those who've gotten pivoted is just, first of all, processing. There can be a lot of shock, a lot of fear, a lot of questioning. Why me? Why now? Why did this happen? But in both cases, there comes a point where you are ready to start taking those next steps. And I found that a lot of business books, and even a lot of career books, don't really say how to do that. We hear, as you said right at the start, we hear the word pivot all the time, but nobody really says how. And that's my intention and my effort, is to say, you do not have to know all the answers, nor do you have to have a plan. But when you are ready, here is how to actually create a sense of forward movement and momentum, and not just feel stuck and like you're spinning out in analysis paralysis.
Yeah, I think if there's a silver lining in this, not that there is, but if there was, and kind of being forced to pivot, there's a story in the book, lady, I think her name is Trisha, where she said the most challenging part of her launch was making the decision. And so for some of us, I think that decision maybe just got a little easier, right? Because it's another option we have.
And yeah, not to make light of the circumstances that so many people find themselves in, but I did ask someone who had gotten laid off, and I said, how do you feel about that? Were you enjoying your job before you were laid off? She said, no, I hated that job. So it's interesting because I do hear quite a mixed reaction, that even the people that are very shocked and surprised, what they'll say to me, so I'm not projecting, I know this isn't the case for everybody, but often what I hear is, I didn't like that job anyway, or I had been wanting to make a change, but I didn't have the courage. And this accelerated my process.
I think one thing that may be a little bit different in planning to pivot and kind of being presented the opportunity with no choice is, in your case, I remember reading that you had a financial plan with a bunch of stages, and you kind of had a trigger point that if you didn't have what you wanted by this point in time, and I think it was dipping into your 401k, if I remember correctly, then you would start looking for a job or doing something different. So that may be a little bit different for somebody who is almost being forced to do it, is they may have had the time to build up the financial resources to let them do it. But it's also like, I guess, being a parent. People say, I'll do it when I'm ready. And the truth is you're never really ready. So perhaps if I'm a financial person myself, so I love numbers, and I may never be able to be ready if I plan it myself. So
What you're referring to are the worst case scenario cash outs and pivot runway. And you're right. I mean, this is a very illustrative moment of, did you start that emergency fund that you had been meaning to start? For me at that time, so this is 2011 when I left Google. You're right. It was things like, what would I do in order if my worst case scenario started to happen and I wasn't earning any money and I needed to pay the rent or pay the mortgage? I would, in order, sell my car, sell my stocks, sell my house, and I went down the list of the things that would be okay to do to the things I really didn't want to do. And then now, almost 10 years later, I lost 90% of my income in March. It just vanished. I do a lot of keynote speaking. I do a lot of licensing pivot programs with large companies. I had a contract that was going to fund my business runway, my business reserves for the next 6 months. And it fell through right when the pandemic was hitting because of what was happening. So there went my runway. And I find myself now a couple months in noticing, wow, what's it like when you still have to go through that worst case scenario cash out situation and just say, okay, I can either let these dominoes fall, of here we are, worst case scenario for me, all my speaking gigs got canceled in an instant and none are going to get booked into the future. This is where having a diversified pivot portfolio is quite helpful. And for me as a business owner, I'm looking at what's the one stream of income that's working. It's a private community I have for heart-based business owners. That's it. That's the remaining stream of income. And the other, it varies from month to month, but 70 to 90% is gone. So now what? I shifted from a weekly podcast to a daily podcast, partly because it's the one thing I can do. It's the one thing in my control. So I'm finding it very interesting to notice we ruminate so much on the fear of these worst case scenarios. And it's just been interesting to me to experience, wow, a pretty big worst case scenario has hit in business. And yet there is, I find, always a silver lining of learning, preparedness, creativity, innovation, intuition, kind of sensing what's needed and what's next. But maybe that's just me because I enjoy studying change now, which I didn't before.
I think the message I kind of get if I'm a listener that has, been forced into being laid off or maybe looking for a job is you're kind of the expert at pivoting, and there's a little nervousness on your part. So I think it's okay to have a little fear.
Of
Just let it
course.
paralyze you.
And it never worked for me to get rid of my fear. That's something that I'm so glad you said that, because I always say it if I'm on stage giving a keynote or now a virtual session where it never worked for me. These messages we hear like conquer your fear, crush your fear, destroy your fear. I always feel a sense of, I have to say it's much less now since even the book came out and I've just made this part of my practice, but we're always going to feel some amount of fear and insecurity and uncertainty. And what the pandemic did was put those qualities front and center. The fact is, any of us could be hit by an unforeseen event and could get pivoted at any moment of any day. And now that reality is just more prominent in front of us. So we're all getting a black belt in pivoting and in accepting uncertainty and accepting fear and insecurity and keep moving. That's all I ever do is just, wow, there it is. It's like an elephant sitting in the room, oh, there's the elephant. Great. Now what's my work today? How can I contribute?
Well, if I remember correctly in the book, you did not actually, you were thinking about, you're at that trigger point where you're going to have to go in and I think it was sell some stock or, take out money out of your 401k, but you ended up not doing that. So the good news is you've had another 5 or 6 years of returns to grow that you can now pull from.
That's true. But yeah, even now I would sooner, I don't know. I feel fortunate, that I haven't had to go into the 401k yet, even now, 9 years later. I think there's something that a lot of financial experts will kind of talk about, which is you can either try to cut as many expenses as possible. And that's good to do, certainly. Eric Schmidt, when I was working at Google, he said the answer to all known problems is revenue. And now we know that's not true, societally speaking, and in our personal lives, but in a business sense or career, it's like I do think that there's an opportunity to get very creative about how we can solve problems that are opening up and earn during this time. I'm not saying it's easy, but I find it interesting to look at what problems have I solved in the past? How have I earned money? Who have been my previous clients? And then, even if you're not ready right now, because I think there's a lot of collective processing that's happening, it's important to not just think, how do I cut? How do I save? Where can I go? What's my worst case scenario? But to also ask, how can I contribute? And what can I earn? How can I serve in a way that will support me and others around me?
I think from a personal experience, having lived through the Great Recession of 2008 and 9 as a business owner, obviously when your revenues drop and plummet, you're doing the first natural reaction is to look at costs and try to cut costs. But we did that obviously as a company, as others did. And one of the people on my management team finally just said, we don't have an expense problem, we have a revenue problem. So the moral of the story is, you got to focus on bringing up the revenues. There's only so much you can do on the cost side.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about this time is that even the bailout of 2008 and 9 compared to the loans and the stipends that are happening now, there's no end in sight. I was just having this conversation with someone earlier today that it's part of the difficulty of pivoting during this time. We don't know when that finish line is or when the new starting line or the quote new normal. And so cutting costs alone probably isn't going to be sustainable because we're actually going to have to figure out how to pivot our skill set and our positions, whether you work for an organization or you're running a small business or a large business. In a way, we're going to have to shift what we're doing quite possibly for the medium term, if not the long term, because we don't know how long this is going to last. So I think the days of just kind of waiting it out, maybe that's what the month of mid-March and April were about. I think now we are going to see that we have to try to figure out a new way forward that keeps things moving, keeps things running, that isn't just about batten down the hatches and sort of hiding and waiting for this to be done.
Yeah. And I think entrepreneurs are kind of made to pivot, right? As an entrepreneurial, when you have an entrepreneurial spirit, you're always kind of looking for what's next and you don't mind pivoting. But do you have tips that for people that maybe have a specialty in only one distinct field and not really sure how to pivot?
That's where I would go back. So one of the biggest mistakes that pivoters make is whether you pivot by choice or by circumstance, the first impulse is saying, okay, I'm at a pivot point. What's out there? Let me look at the job boards. Who can I talk to? And that creates a lot of overwhelm and a lot of paralysis, if not panic. So if you're somebody who is feeling that way, I would encourage you to spend more time really unpacking what are your skills and unpacking what do you want moving forward. Even if it's hard to find the silver lining, what might that be? How is this moment an opportunity for you to create something new? And only once you're really anchored in what's working, what energizes you the most, and some loosely held vision for what would resonate, then I think it's much easier to go about the networking and searching for opportunities. I also think we're all going to be asked to do the work of building a bridge from our past experience to what's needed now. And again, now being a two-part equation, there's now under the pandemic umbrella, and then there's going to be what's needed that sort of transcends what's happening in the pandemic. So for example, a lot of clothing manufacturers have pivoted to making masks. Okay, great. That's needed as long as the mandate is everybody wear a mask, or even the best practice, if
Right.
not a mandate. And then thinking beyond the days where everyone's going to want a mask, or everyone now owns a mask and they're not needed anymore, at least setting aside the healthcare profession. Then what's that manufacturer? What's the new normal in terms of are twice as many people working from home and therefore you're introducing an athleisure line, whereas you didn't have one before? Okay, so it's like thinking about what goes beyond the emergency mode, but fits into the new way of working and being that we're all creating as we speak. That's the crazy thing about right now is we're all in this together and therefore no one has the answer. So I think it can be somewhat empowering to realize I'm not the only one that's sort of hung out to dry right now. I'm not the only one out in a kayak in the middle of the ocean, that actually we're all in these little kayaks trying to figure out, okay, what's next? And nobody has that answer. And don't feel bad if you don't, because we're all co-creating it together every single day.
It's actually kind of a strange time, especially to be a young person. I mean, think about how many people have had the last quarter of their school wiped away. They've had to graduate virtually, not go to their prom. Internships to gain experiences have been canceled. So how can young people prepare themselves for this crazy new world we're going to move into?
I just did a rant on my podcast called Be Willing to Be the Exception, because I can't think of anything more disempowering for today's grads than these headlines that say students who graduate in a recession earn less for the rest of their career. What a terrible way to enter the job market and to enter your career with this thought hanging over your head. So for starters, be willing to be the exception, even if statistically speaking, we can't all be, but just do not let these disempowering stories about what's not possible and what's going to impair you for the rest of your life, just shake it off. First, just shake it off. Anything is possible. Nobody has the answers. We're all creating it as we go. So if you're graduating today, you're getting, in a way, I think you're getting a fast track to the nature of careers these days. Nothing is secure, and nobody for 10 years now, a college degree has not guaranteed a job. Those two things just do not match. Like, I studied communications and political science, and I could guarantee my coursework did not prepare me to work at the startup that I did. That was my first job out of school. However, a relationship of becoming the professor's research assistant, that is what led to the job at the startup. And that is what launched my entire career and was the foundation for my first book, Life After College. So I don't know the exact source of this statistic, but something like 80% of jobs still come through word of mouth. So for anybody who's graduating now or somebody earlier in their career that doesn't quite have the depth of experience, be proactive about educating yourself and building your own skills. And the same questions apply. What have you always loved to do, even since you were a little kid? What did you do for fun? What were the games you played for make-believe? What little projects did you create? What extracurriculars did you do after school? And you wouldn't believe how many times those come to pass as adults. You know, just today I was talking to somebody who sold toys when he was in middle school. He had this little business of selling toys to his fellow students. Today, he runs a multi-million-dollar toy company. He is still selling toys, and it's this global toy company that thread has gone all the way through. So I think it's really important that everybody connect what it is you enjoy with what the market needs. And that second piece is what's unfolding. So you're going to learn that skill of actually saying, what problems can I solve with the skills that I have and what's needed? And then figure out, okay, because the job role that you take might not exist yet. I'm now hearing there's a role of Zoom coordinator for these virtual weddings. That role did not exist even 6 months ago.
There'll be a lot of applicants, I believe.
I think so. And there's a lot of people that will be incredibly qualified to do that. Think about all the students who have now done a whole semester virtually, or at least half a semester. Great. They'll jump into all kinds of family members. I'm not saying everybody wants to become a Zoom coordinator, but people are getting very creative about the companies and side projects and roles that they're creating. So it's fair game if you are willing to ask the question, what can I create? Rather than just, why won't anybody pick me? Because it is going to be a hard time to get picked.
For sure. Do you think there are people that are more prone to embracing pivot and other people that say, you know, this is not me. I would just want to go do my job. And do you find that people fall into one or two camps, or do you think anybody can embrace pivoting?
It's a little bit of both. I will say I never thought I was cut out for entrepreneurship. I once wrote a blog post called, "You Might Be Completely Wrong About Your Shortcomings." And I remember thinking, I'm a good student, I'm a good employee, I'm a good team player. I never got MVP on my softball team in high school. I always got coach's award. You know, like I was certainly not the best player. I was just the one that tried the hardest. What does that even mean? And so I just thought, I'm too nervous. I'm too risk averse. I'm not cut out for entrepreneurship. And yet here I am now, almost a decade in running my business, and it's so joyful. There's not a day that I've regretted my decision to leave Google. I still work with them to this day as one of my clients, but I'm very happy it's under the container of self-employment. So don't count yourself out. Again, you might be wrong about your shortcomings. I think you're right. Some people, it depends what your driving values are. Freedom is a big value of mine, creativity, impact. There are others, and maybe it depends on your family situation, where security is your number one value. And I definitely know people where the nature of their work doesn't matter as much as the stability and security, and they're fine to go do any kind of job and come home at the end of the day and their meaning really comes outside of work. And I think that's totally okay too. There's that framework of a job, career, and a calling. And it might be helpful for listeners to just think about, do I feel called to something? Or am I really okay with having a job and there's no judgment around what that looks like? It's just a matter of priorities and where you are in your life.
There's probably more job safety actually if you're an entrepreneur because you control yourself and you don't have to fire anybody but yourself. So that's always a good thing.
Right. And you can diversify more. Because I do think that as an employee, and that's why it's kind of, I'm not going to say everybody needs to have a side hustle. It's a lot of work. But maybe you want to have side projects or side skill building that you can be more resilient, because that's the thing. Even security is an illusion, especially these days, even pre-pandemic. I just say in the book that Google was reorging more than they were orging. There was always a reorg happening. So you're never really guaranteed job security these days anyway, even if you think that you're employed full time.
When you think about reorgs, there's a Dilbert cartoon that I'm sure I won't get it exactly right, but I've always loved this cartoon about reorganization. So Dilbert, of course, is the engineer, and the boss, they refer to him as the pointy-haired boss. And Wally is the ne'er-do-well who doesn't actually do any work. He just walks around all day drinking coffee and avoiding work. So the pointy-haired boss is announcing another reorg. And Wally says, so are you admitting that every reorg previously announced was an abject failure? Or have you fundamentally changed our business? And the pointy-haired boss says, well, Wally, if you're riding along in a car and you get a flat tire, what do? He says, if I'm you, apparently I rotate the tires and drive on.
Oh, that's so funny.
So
it is so funny.
I had a client who had this division inside the company had a really bad reputation. And so they fixed it every year by renaming the division. They didn't really change anything. They just called it something different every year. So you had to go figure out, okay, what's the new name that I have to avoid, right?
The new name, the new manager, the new desk. I mean, that is really the world we live in now. It's true. And that's why the subtitle of the book is The Only Move That Matters Is Your Next One. Because even if you think you can know 2 moves out, the world shifts. It rotates on its axis. And especially this pandemic, I say it's like shaking up a snow globe. The particles haven't even landed yet. They're all just still mixed around, flying in the sky.
Yeah. I mean, I do planning for a living, and we plan big projects like Olympics and FIFA World Cup events for one of the major sponsors and do construction projects. Your goal of getting to the end game doesn't change, but the path you take to get there can change quite often. And so you might know your next step, but all the ones between then and the end are fluid.
So you must have a lot of clients mid-pivot if you do event planning. And
yeah, we have some that, one of my colleagues, I called her as soon as this all happened. She also lives in New York. And I said, how you doing? Because what she does is she books speakers. And so literally her business just went to zero because nobody's booking speakers. And, the best thing I can do for those people is just reach out to them and, hey, tell them I'm thinking about them and I care. And what can I do to help you? But even with somebody like you or our company has a revenue drop, unless it goes to zero, we're probably better off than a lot of others. So,
yeah.
Well, it's time to take a break. Coming up in part 2 of my conversation with Jenny Blake, the founder and CEO of the Pivot Method, Jenny tells us why people shouldn't prioritize finding a mentor.
I have had so much success networking with peers where we kind of help spiral each other upward in our career without the pressure of trying to get the attention of a mentor.
Thanks for listening to The Conversation with Clinton and Padgett. To find out more about Clint, go to projectsuccess.com or pick up Clint's book, The Project Success Method, at amazon.com. This has been a production of Forbes Books Radio.